Hello, I'm Assistant Professor Christiana Esguerra from the Philippines. I teach at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. I'm also a professional journalist focusing on different issues such as human rights, foreign policy, governance, and legislation. These are the focus of my reporting throughout my career as a journalist. And welcome to today's discussion, which is focused on the South China Sea. Okay, so my presentation for today is titled Understanding the Duterte-China Alliance and Was It Worth It? So it's very important to talk about this issue because the presidency of President Rodrigo Duterte was from 2016 to 2022. And just last May, we had another presidential election, and Filipinos, 31 million of them, elected the new president, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., to replace President Rodrigo Duterte. Now, the term of President Rodrigo Duterte, those 6 years while he was in office, represented a particular tectonic shift in Philippine foreign policy. At least that's how it was viewed at the start, in the sense that President Rodrigo Duterte implemented the so-called pivot to China, because the Philippines is considered or was considered to be under the influence of the United States. And under President Rodrigo Duterte, he shifted, not exactly, I'm not talking about allegiance here, but in terms of closeness, he became, the Philippines became even closer to China compared to its closeness with the United States under President Rodrigo Duterte. So that particular foreign policy shift was made in the context of so-called economic benefits or aid coming from Beijing. Now, the question is, was it worth it? Now, before we answer this question, we also have to first talk about the importance of the South China Sea, because that particular pivot of President Rodrigo Duterte was heavily criticized because many Filipinos were concerned that that shift or that pivot was made at the expense of the Philippines' interest in the West Philippine Sea, which is connected, of course, or part of the South China Sea. Now, the West Philippine Sea, or the WPS, represented the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone of the Philippines, representing 200 nautical miles. So within this area, surrounding the Philippines, under international law, the Philippines exercises so-called sovereign rights over resources found in the West Philippine Sea. But the problem is, China is claiming more than 80% of the entire South China Sea, much to the protest, and also compromising the legitimate interests of other claimant countries, including the Philippines. So there are two separate areas which are affecting the interests of other claimants in this area, because China is claiming more than 80% of this using the so-called 9-line doctrine, which is considered fake information, but it has been it has been propagated over decades, over the years by China, despite being debunked already. So that is the basis of their expansive claim over the South China Sea. Now, this particular claim by China affects the interest in particular of the Philippines, because even parts of the West Philippine Sea, or again, which represents the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, China has been encroaching on the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Okay, now the South China Sea is important not just to China, not just to the United States, not just to claimant countries such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. It's important because we're talking here of international trade. It's a vital waterway, which involves more than $5 trillion in shipborne trade. That is the amount of shipborne trade that passes through this vital waterway annually. It's also being disputed because of the rich resources that are found in or under the South China Sea. Aside from fishing resources, we're also talking about major unexplored oil and gas deposits. Now, so far, in the case of the Philippines, it has been very, very difficult for the Philippines to conduct drilling operations, explorations, gas explorations in our own exclusive economic zone because China has been stopping it. And things didn't exactly get better under President Rodrigo Duterte because while he wanted to achieve better relations with China in exchange for so-called economic benefits. Let's see toward the latter part of this discussion whether that worked. But right at the onset, it must be said that that didn't exactly work, and it remains to be seen whether it remains to be seen what kind of a foreign policy strategy the new administration of President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. would implement um, in connection with China. Again, as I mentioned, the South China Sea matters because, for example, going by 2016 figures alone, the global trade through the South China Sea represented $3.3 million dollars. And of course, the estimate has been much larger annually, which, as I mentioned, $5 million in shipborne trade. Now, in 2012, before I talk about this particular slide, in 2012, there was a very there was an incident that happened in Scarborough Shoal, um, which was ruled later on as a traditional fishing ground by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in the Netherlands. There was a standoff between Philippine Navy vessels and Chinese maritime vessels because the Philippine authorities arrested Chinese poachers who were exploiting illegally resources in that particular part of the South China Sea. Scarborough Shoal is much closer to the Philippines, and it has been considered as a traditional fishing ground. But after after the Philippine authorities accosted these Chinese poachers, the Chinese authorities came to the rescue and blocked the path of Philippine authorities, which led to a long standoff. Now, that was uh, that was eventually resolved, but not to the favor of the Philippines, because since 2012, China has been in control effectively of that crucial shoal, and Filipino fishermen, including other foreign fishermen like the Vietnamese, found it very, very difficult to actually catch fish in that area unless the Chinese allowed it. So there was a lot of pressure coming from the Chinese authorities following that crucial standoff in 2012. Now, in 2012, the president of the Philippines was still President Benigno Aquino III, the late President Benigno Aquino III. So 4 years, the following year, after that standoff, the Aquino administration in the Philippines decided to sue China, meaning to bring the matter before the arbitral court. The arbitral court was called the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The PCA, the Philippines wanted the PCA to clarify maritime entitlements within the West Philippine Sea or the exclusive economic zone. Now, in 2016, 4 years after the standoff, the PCA in The Hague came out with a ruling in favor of the Philippines. The Philippines won the arbitral case. China didn't participate. China refused to recognize the process, but it didn't matter because the decision was binding, but there was no enforcement clause or mechanism. We will go to that later on. But the findings were very, very clear. It clarified the maritime entitlements in this in the West Philippine Sea. The tribunal, for one, invalidated the basis of China's sweeping claims over the South China Sea, the so-called nine-dash-line doctrine. Okay, and number two, it's also important to note that the tribunal found that the, found the unlawful actions of China, for example, interfering with Philippine fishing and petroleum exploration, constructing artificial islands, basically land reclamation, building artificial islands and installing vital military equipment in those reclaimed land, much again against the interests of the Philippines and other nearby countries. Now, also failing to prevent Chinese fishermen from fishing in the zone. So these are clear findings by the Permanent Court of Arbitration based on international law, in particular the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. It also found another very depressing reality in the South China Sea: the effect on the marine environment by China's illegal activities in the South China Sea, the destruction of large swaths of coral reefs following the construction of artificial islands by China. Now, while many people were expecting the Philippines to make use of that victory in 2016, on July 12, 2016, they were in for a surprise because President Rodrigo Duterte came into power on June 30, 2016. And a little over a week after he came to power, the Permanent Court of Arbitration released its findings, okay, the ruling. But instead of making use of that ruling to the advantage of the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte downplayed it. He actually, the perspective coming from the new president then was, give China a soft landing. Don't shame China. Don't gloat over the victory, and basically set it aside. In one particular speech in December 2016, a few months after the ruling came out, Mr. Duterte said, "In the play of politics now, I will set aside the arbitral ruling." Okay, this made China very, very happy. Now, what was the exchange according to President Rodrigo Duterte? What did he want to achieve after that? Well, during a visit to China, and he visited China on a number of occasions early during his administration. Here, there's a picture of President Rodrigo Duterte with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. He took home $24 billion worth of deals, okay? But these were mostly pledges, okay? Pledges. In exchange for that, he went to the extent of saying during an October visit, he said this in the presence of Chinese authorities. He said, in this venue, Your Honors, in this venue, I announce my separation from the United States, both in military, not in social, but both in military, but economic. Okay? This was such a tectonic shift in foreign policy coming from the Philippines. And this was actually said by President Rodrigo Duterte. And a lot of people were alarmed, not just the United States. Now, of course, the Philippines is the oldest treaty ally of the United States in Asia. And we have a long-standing mutual defense treaty between Washington and Manila. This is the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. And we also have a visiting forces agreement. The VFA, or the visiting forces agreement, concerned the conduct of American soldiers whenever they visited the Philippines for training, and also Filipino soldiers whenever they visited the United States during training. There was also a related Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, which talked about the use of Philippine camps by the United States without exactly, of course, gaining permanency in the use of those Philippine military camps. Now, all these arrangements seem to be in trouble following the statement by President Rodrigo Duterte. And there's also, of course, a long history between the United States and the Philippines following the American occupation also of the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century. Of course, the Spaniards sold the Philippines to the United States, which led to the bloody Filipino-American War. And then, of course, the Philippines was occupied by Japan during the Second World War. and the United States helped liberate the Philippines from Japanese rule. And since then, it has been a long alliance between Washington and Manila. So the Philippines is considered to be under the sphere of influence of the United States. And this was quite, my apologies for that. And this is quite an interesting statement coming from our president back in 2016. Now, let's talk about what the Philippines gained and lost after that. Well, well, some countries were concerned about the so-called debt trap in the Philippines. The problem was pledge trap because much of the resources, much of the money, or the amounts promised by China, by Beijing to the Philippines, based on discussions with the Philippine authorities led by President Rodrigo Duterte, most of them did not materialize, meaning the projects. So according to one analyst, Mr. Richard Hedarian, the Philippines was actually a victim of pledge trap, not debt trap, because the money or the projects, many of them didn't actually arrive. So as Duterte enters his twilight months in office, according to him, the two neighbors have failed to finalize even a single big-ticket infrastructure project, nor have the Philippines and China clinched any cooperative agreement in the disputed waters or a major defense agreement. If anything, the South China Sea disputes have festered, with China now having fully militarized a whole host of Philippine-claimed land features in the area. In short, the so-called sacrifice or the fact that our former president decided to get closer to China, somehow compromise Philippine interests in the West Philippine Sea in exchange for economic aid, benefits, and pledges and other business deals, since many of them, if not most of them, did not materialize, was it worth it? The answer is no. Okay. According to one analyst from he is the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, Professor Greg Poling. China has launched just two of the pledged infrastructure projects. They were a bridge and an irrigation project, and both have hit major snags that could scuttle them altogether. So it wasn't really worth it in the sense that the Philippines somehow lost a very important leverage, which was the legal victory in 2016. Since it was set aside by the president, basically, we had that legal victory. The law, international law, was on our side, but our president decided not to use it in exchange for economic benefits that did not exactly materialize. In the meantime, Chinese harassment and pressure on Philippine vessels, whether civilian or members of the Coast Guard or the Philippine Navy, they are still happening as we speak. There's a lot of Chinese intimidation in the West Philippine Sea, despite this clear ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration that China, based on international law, has no business encroaching in Philippine waters in the West Philippine Sea, which again represents the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Some of these incidents that took place despite President Duterte's friendliness with China, the continued intimidation and harassment of the Philippine resupply mission in this particular shoal, Ayungin. This is an important outpost by the Philippines located within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Several years ago, in the late 1990s, the Philippine military purposely stranded an aging vessel, the so-called BRP, Sierra Madre, on the shoal to be able to create an instant military outpost there. It has been deteriorating over the years, but there's been a constant resupply of soldiers assigned to guard that ship in that particular outpost. And periodically, the Philippine military sends a team to replenish the supply and to replace the soldiers assigned on the vessel. But China has been consistently harassing that resupply mission. There's also, of course, China's overfishing in the West Philippine Sea, which could compromise food security by the Philippines. Of course, there's also the problem of oil and gas exploration because during the Duterte administration, there was a memorandum of understanding for China and the Philippines to conduct joint oil and gas exploration in the West Philippine Sea. Under the Constitution, foreigners such as China has no business actually claiming full ownership of the resources there because according to our Constitution, the resources found in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines are for the sole benefit of Filipinos. And certain arrangements can be done so long as the other party would recognize that particular provision in our Constitution, meaning the Philippines can subcontract certain projects such as oil drilling and exploration with countries like China, but it has to be clear, it has to be explicit that they are recognizing the Philippine Constitution in that particular agreement. Now, toward the end of the Duterte administration, discussions between joint oil and gas explorations bogged down, and it remains to be seen whether this would be reset under the new administration of President Marcos. In the meantime, China's activities are continuing, in particular the presence of Chinese maritime militia. These are basically on the surface, they are civilian vessels, but in reality, they are part of the Chinese maritime militia. The danger is that if you attack the Chinese maritime militia, you'd automatically be considered as the aggressor, and there's danger of conflict escalating. And that could actually be seen as an excuse by China to attack other countries, including the Philippines. So, but the problem is this Chinese vessels, although they appear to be civilian vessels on the surface, they're actually involved in harassing Philippine vessels. They swarm Philippine vessels, prevent us from doing what we are supposed to do, or exercising our rights in the West Philippine Sea without actually firing guns. But the harassment is there. They swarm certain areas. They get as close as possible, for instance, to certain Philippine claimed features. They can even provoke Philippine authorities. And only God knows where that could lead to. So the question now is, what's next for the Philippines, given that we have a new president who was elected by 31 million Filipinos last May 9? This is President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. He is the son of the late dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. So he is seen in this photo with the Chinese ambassador to Manila. What's next for the Philippines? The honest answer is that we don't know, because we hardly heard anything from President Marcos during the campaign of what he intended to do. Although toward the latter part, he said that he mentioned the arbitral ruling, and that is very important, and that would be used. But again, that remains to be seen. The other question is, how effective would the Philippines be in terms of rallying international support behind that legal victory that we have over China in the West Philippine Sea? Again, that remains to be seen. But the point is, it's very important for all of us to actually monitor what's happening in the South China Sea, because this concerns not just China or the Philippines and other claimant countries, but the rest of the world. Because as I mentioned, $5 million worth of global trade passes through this vital waterway annually. On that note, thank you very much and have a good day.